NASCAR just announced some major rules changes for both the Truck Series and the Xfinity Series next year. Live pit stops are going to be going away at a select number of races next year. We've got to talk about that. We also have to talk about Team Penske because they just completely overhauled their crew chief driver pairing lineup. We got to talk about who the winners and the losers are of this announcement as well. So lots to discuss on today's episode. Let's get to it, y'all. How's it going, everyone? My name is Eric and welcome to Out of the Groove. Yeah, we've got a lot to talk about today. Earlier, NASCAR published a very confusing press release. That is actually trying to explain, I think, a fairly simple change regarding pit stops in the Trucks Xfinity Series next year. We'll talk about all that here a little bit later, but before that, I want to briefly hit on Team Penske because they were in the news yesterday. Ryan Blaney, Brad Keselowski, Joey Logano getting some new crew chiefs in 2020. Kind of a late decision here. We're only about a month or so away from Speed Weeks. The three current Penske drivers are staying the same, and actually the three current Penske crew chiefs are also staying the same. They're just mixing it up a little bit. So in 2020, Joey Logano will be working with Paul Wolfe, Ryan Blaney is going to be working with Todd Gordon, and Brad Keselowski is going to be working with Jeremy Bullen. So they're keeping all the names the same, they're just switching them around. It's like speed dating, where they ring the bell and then everyone gets up and slides over one seat to the next person. That's basically how this Penske crew chief rearrangement is working out. But a quick analysis here, this is surprising because I think last year, most people would agree, Penske was probably the second, maybe the third best organization in NASCAR. Nobody was touching Joe Gibbs Racing throughout most of the season, but at least in the first third of the year, Team Penske was giving them a run for their money. Brad Keselowski got a couple wins, Logano was winning some races and was consistently up at the top of the points grid, but they kind of teetered off towards the end of the season. You have to believe that's probably why Roger Penske is opting to make these changes, because they fizzled out at the end of last year and Joe Gibbs Racing and even Stewart-Haas Racing, some of the other teams clearly started to pull ahead later in the year, but still Penske was very competitive last year. All three of their drivers won at least one race, so this change is pretty surprising, but let's talk about it really quick. So Joey Logano getting Paul Wolfe, who's a championship crew chief. He's been working with Brad Keselowski pretty much ever since Keselowski got to Penske. They've won a bunch of races together. Paul Wolfe, Joey Logano, championship driver, championship crew chief. They're going to work well together. I don't see Joey Logano and that 22 team really missing a beat at all next year. I think they'll win some races, be competitive, all sorts of stuff that we're used to seeing from them. What's interesting here is this makes it sound like Team Penske is really investing in Ryan Blaney's future. Remember, Ryan Blaney is technically a free agent after the 2020 season, as well as most of the drivers in the Cup Series, but Ryan Blaney's a pretty high-profile free agent. Most people, I think, assume he'll stay with Team Penske, but he doesn't have to. So Roger Penske giving him Todd Gordon, who's also a championship crew chief. He won the 2018 championship with Joey Logano just a couple of years ago. He's won a bunch of races. He's a pretty solid crew chief, pretty good NASCAR mind. I think pairing him up with Blaney is definitely going to help that 12 car, definitely going to help out Ryan Blaney next year. Blaney spent the last 2 years now with Team Penske, and that whole time he's clearly been the third wheel over at that organization. It's Keselowski and Logano at the top, and Blaney's noticeably been just a little bit behind them. Now teaming up with Todd Gordon next year, I think there's no excuses for Ryan Blaney anymore. I don't think you can say he's being held back by his team anymore. I think next year Ryan Blaney's got to win some races. I think he's got to continue to take steps forward in his career, or else people are going to start to raise questions and his options for 2021 might change. But I think Ryan Blaney gets a good deal here. I think Todd Gordon's going to help him out quite a bit, so I expect Ryan Blaney to take a small step forward in 2020. The guy who I think might have gotten shafted here is Brad Keselowski. Brad Keselowski has been with Penske longer than Logano or Blaney. He's sort of, I guess you could say he is the leader of that team as far as from the driver's perspective. Jeremy Bullen has plenty of experience. He's been an Xfinity Series crew chief for a long time. He's actually been a Cup Series crew chief for a few years now. He's been with Ryan Blaney ever since Blaney came up in that 21 car and showed up for the Wood Brothers. He's been a Cup Series, Xfinity Series crew chief for a good handful of years, and he's had some success. But compared to Paul Wolfe, Todd Gordon, Jeremy Bullen's kind of like Ryan Blaney's been the last few years, is clearly the third string at Team Penske. So Brad Keselowski, yes, he may be the best driver of the three, but I think they're teaming him up with probably the least accomplished, at least, crew chief of the three. I saw a lot of Keselowski fans were kind of miffed by this. Oh, why would they give Keselowski the least experienced guy, the least accomplished guy? Why would they do their veteran driver like this? I wouldn't get too worried though, Brad Keselowski fans. There is a glimmer of hope here with this change. See, I mentioned Jeremy Bullen has a lot of Xfinity Series crew chiefing experience. He's worked with Brad Keselowski actually quite a bit the last several years down in that Xfinity Series, and they've had a lot of success in that series. In fact, when I was doing research for this episode, I went on to Racing Reference just to look at the numbers, look at the stats, and look at the 2014 season specifically. Jeremy Bullen was the full-time crew chief for the 22 car that year in the Xfinity Series. And that year he worked with Ryan Blaney for 10 races. They had 1 win. He also worked with Joey Logano for 9 races that year. They didn't have any wins. But in the 11 races he ran with Brad Keselowski that year, they won 5 of them and finished in the top 10 in all 11. 10 top 5s in 11 races. So notice noticeably, the performance when Jeremy Bullins was working with Brad Keselowski was way better than when Jeremy Bullins was working with Blaney or anyone else. And even if I look back at 2013, Keselowski and Bullins won 6 races together that year, so back in the day when Keselowski was still racing a lot of Xfinity races, Bullins was the full-time crew chief down there, Bullins and Keselowski seem to have a connection that no other, Penske pairing had in that series. So if you're an optimist, I would look at those numbers and say that, hey, maybe Jeremy Bullins and Brad Keselowski really have a deeper relationship than we realized. Maybe their communication is just really, really good. And maybe this is actually going to work out really well. This might work out better for both the driver and the crew chief. Jeremy Bullins might start winning more races. Keselowski might get back to his championship contending form. This could be a match made in heaven. But we'll have to wait and see, because so far Jeremy Bullins in the Cup Series has not done a whole lot, but maybe he and Keselowski will just be, lightning in a bottle. I tried snapping there. I forgot I can't snap with my left hand. I can snap with my right, that's pathetic. Anyway, major sweeping crew chief changes over there at Penske. Gonna see how that works in 2020. That's gonna be interesting. It's also interesting that they waited until the middle of January. Well, I guess we're still early January, but still, they waited until the new year to make these announcements. You feel like this has been something they would have announced a while back, so they could have spent the entire offseason with these plans. Kind of surprising they waited this long, but we'll see. I'm sure it'll not affect their performance too much in 2020. Penske's still going to be one of the top teams, if you ask me. Alrighty, let's talk about these new Xfinity Truck Series rules that NASCAR just revealed. This got a lot of people talking on social media, a lot of people heated, a lot of people asking questions, rightfully so, because like I said earlier, the press release NASCAR put out, very confusing. I had to read it 3 or 4 times to kind of get an understanding of what they were talking about. They released a graphic as well. I had to read a lot of things to fully understand the full picture of what these changes are and what they're really going to mean for the sport next year. But now that I've looked at everything, I'm going to try to explain things as simply as possible. Hopefully much better than NASCAR explained things. Because I think a lot of fans were putting out a lot of very opinionated opinions on Twitter and other social medias, and I think a lot of these fans didn't fully understand the rule change. So I'm going to try to clarify a bunch of things here in this episode right now. So let's get started. So in a nutshell, NASCAR is changing the way pit stops are going to work for 4 Xfinity races next year and 3 Truck Series races next year. Specifically for the Xfinity Series, we're talking about Mid-Ohio, both Iowa races, and Road America. For the Truck Series, we're talking about Gateway, Iowa, and Canadian Tire Motorsports Park. And now the reason these races were selected specifically is because these are weekends where either Xfinity or Truck are out on their own. They're not accompanying the Cup Series these weekends. They're by themselves. So in these 7 races, again, only 7 races, a very small sample size that we're actually going to see these rules in place next year. But in these 7 races, NASCAR is limiting the number of road crew members that each team can have to 8. Each race team can only bring 8 road crew members. And the 6 guys that they actually send over the wall to do pit stops have to be part of that number of 8. You can't have a separate group that's your pit crew and another separate group that's just the people that set up the car. Nope, it has to be 8 people, and of those 8, 6 of them have to also be pitting the car. Now, the part of these changes that get confusing is when we talk about how this is actually going to affect the pit stops in the race itself. So I'm going to do my best to explain this right here. Effectively, this new rule is eliminating live pit stops for these select number of Xfinity and Truck Series races. In other words, in these races, when a caution comes out, the field will be frozen. And then when a normal caution comes out, teams will then have 2 opportunities to pit during this yellow. During yellow flag pit stops at oval tracks like Iowa, teams can come in and add fuel and change 2 tires per pit stop, but you can't do 4 tires and fuel on the same stop. You have to only do 2 tires and or fuel. On road courses, teams may add fuel or change 4 tires, so no 2 tire changes, and you can't do fuel and 4 tires again. You have to decide whether you're going to do fuel only or 4 tires only. Again, these are only during regular caution periods. Going back to ovals, if you do want to change 4 tires during a caution period, that's what the second opportunity to pit is. You can pit twice, but you're going to lose track position if you do that. And now these are not technically live pit stops. NASCAR will have a designated amount of time that you're allowed to spend pitting the car, and you have to be done in that allotted amount of time, but it's not going to be like a race off pit road the way we've traditionally seen. Once pit stops are complete and NASCAR is ready to line up for the restart, teams will line up with drivers who stayed out completely lining up in the front. Behind them will be drivers who pitted only 1 time, and then behind them will be the drivers who pit twice during that caution. And then of course behind them will be free pass, wave around, cars that are a lap down, the usual stuff like we're used to seeing. Now there are certain shortened caution periods called quickie yellows, and in those cases you're only able to pit 1 time. If you're on an oval, you have to come in and you can only do 2 tires and fuel. If it's a road course, you can only do fuel or 4 tires. I know it's still kind of confusing, right? I'm doing my best. I feel like once we see this in action, the first time we see this in a race, it's going to become pretty clear pretty quickly. I don't think it's super complicated once we see it in action. It just feels complicated right now because it's kind of foreign to a lot of us. But let's keep going here. I'm doing my best. All right, so I've talked about how yellow flag scenarios are going to work mostly, but now what about green flag pit stops? We haven't talked about green flag pit stops. Well, on green flag pit stops, teams are only allowed to add fuel to the car. They're not allowed to change tires under green unless they're approved by NASCAR because, say, they had a flat tire, a tire's going down, they had tire damage in some way, shape, or form. Only if they're approved by NASCAR are they allowed to then go in and change a tire, and the only way NASCAR is going to approve that is if they have some sort of damage or some sort of incident like that. That's the only way they're going to be allowed to change tires during green flag runs. And the reason NASCAR can do this is because at those select races, Xfinity and Truck Series races that we're going to see these rules implemented, the stages are never longer than a fuel run. So in other words, teams are never going to have to pit for fuel under green because the stages are all short enough, except for a couple select ones. Eldora is a standalone race that's going to have its own pit stop rules because it's a dirt race. It's always been its own thing. Also Texas, the Texas race in June for the trucks is also not going to abide by these pit road rules because their stages are longer and they're going to have to go back to the original way they always do pit stops for that race specifically. But at these other races, Iowa, some of the road courses, Gateway, the stages are short enough that we don't need to pit under green, so that's why NASCAR is basically saying don't pit under green. That's basically what NASCAR is saying. Now, as you can see on this graphic NASCAR posted, there are penalties for if you do not abide by these new rules. You can see there some of the penalties could cause you to restart the tail end, or you could lose 2 laps. Really, if you pit for 4 tires, NASCAR is not going to be on your side for that one. All right, so I think I've pretty much covered the entire new rules change overhaul here in a nutshell. Just a summary here. In these 7 races, again, it's just 7 races, 4 Xfinity races, 3 truck races. It's not going to be very many races this year. If you pit under green, the only way you're allowed to change tires is if you were involved in some sort of incident and NASCAR approves it. In these races under caution at oval tracks, you're allowed to take 2 tires and fuel at a time. Can't do more than that. And on road courses, you can either do fuel or 4 tires. You have to choose between one or the other. It's going to open up the door for a lot of interesting strategy calls. And if you want to pit a second time under caution, that's when you can take 4 tires and everything, but that'll cause you to start behind everyone who pitted only once. And there isn't going to be a race off pit road. The running order after pit stops is going to be the same as the way it was when you entered pit road. Except, of course, if certain cars or drivers stayed out entirely, they will obviously assume the lead, but behind them, the field will be frozen. So the way you entered pit road is the way you're going to come off. And then, of course, another key component of this rule is that it's limiting the size of road crews that each team can have. This is, of course, in an attempt to cut costs once again, so the big teams can't bring 20 guys, can't bring a whole Cup Series pit crew out here. It's going to kind of even the competition there in that sense. 8 guys total, and 6 of those 8 have to be the ones who pit the car. So that's basically the rest of the rule change right there. In a nutshell, that's it. I skipped over the quickie yellow bit. Again, quickie yellows, you only get 1 chance to pit. You don't get 2 chances to pit. All right, there it is. That's it in a nutshell. That's what's got NASCAR all over, fans all over the place, riled up today. As usual, anytime NASCAR enacts a new rule or comes up with a new rule, fans are going to share their opinions. And that's what I'm here to do too. I'm a fan. I'm sharing my opinion, so let's get to it. Clearly, the main reason this rule is being put into place is to save some of these teams money. You know, Truck Series, it's a small series. Let's be real. You guys see how many people are in the stands for an average Truck Series race. It's a small series. Xfinity 2, not a big series. Not a lot of money being put into the Xfinity Series or the Truck Series. A lot of those teams, a lot of the competitors in those series are very small. They're scrapping by, you know? Saving some money on logistics like this, not having to fly out a whole pit crew, not having to do all these things like that on an average weekend, not having to pit the car as often, saves money on tires perhaps. These are all important cost-saving measures for a lot of these small teams. And I've already seen on Twitter a lot of small team drivers, team owners, etc. Tommy Joe Martins has been very outspoken about how much he supports this rule. It's going to be helpful for a lot of these race teams, especially the smaller ones. It's going to technically help the big teams too. You know, they can now spend that money somewhere else if they want to, but they want to save it, they definitely can. It's going to help the big teams if they want, but it's definitely going to help the smaller teams. So this is a good rule in that case. And here's what Eric Peterson, he's like one of the heads of the Xfinity Series, here's what he said about this new rule change in this statement, and he basically just said what I just said. The standalones in general provide some additional logistical and efficiency challenges for Gander trucks and Xfinity teams. Anytime you have races where we're not a companion to Cup, or Cup is in a different area of the country, it is logistically harder for the Xfinity and truck teams to accomplish those races and do all the things we do on a normal weekend. A lot of the teams, a good portion, not all of them, do utilize sharing pit crew personnel between Cup and Xfinity and Gander trucks, that it is a logistical hurdle for the teams to fly those individuals back and forth. Trying this procedure at these events certainly alleviates a lot of that burden on the teams to make that happen. So cost cutting is definitely one of the key reasons why these rules are being put into place for just a handful of races next year. Again, in the grand scheme of things, saving some money on pit crews for 4 races in the Xfinity Series, 3 races in the Truck Series isn't going to matter that much in the big picture. Let's be honest, because trucks still race over 20 times a year. Xfinity races 30 times a year. What's 3 or 4 races really going to do? It's going to help, but how much is it really going to help? Let's be honest here. Now, another thing NASCAR mentioned, besides just cutting some costs and helping teams stay afloat, perhaps, NASCAR also said that they think this will help kind of even the playing field, even the competition a little bit, and I think they have a point here. Yes, big teams are still going to spend the money that they're saving probably on other things at some point or another, but at the same time, when we just look at pit road, traditionally, the smaller teams who don't have the best pit crews always would lose spots on pit road in these Trucks and Xfinity races. They'd always lose spots. The big teams would always gain spots on pit road. With the field being frozen like this and with live pit stops basically being done away with, now that's not going to happen. The small teams will retain their track position more often than not. And that at least will even up the field a little bit in that sense. Now, it was reported a few months back, and we talked about it on this show, that NASCAR was considering removing live pit stops from the Xfinity and Truck Series, at least some of their races for 2020. That was rumored months back. We talked about it on this show, and now that's completely come true. And I remember saying it then, and I'm going to say it again now, that if it helps teams save money, I'm all for it. Because while I like pit stops, while I love live pit stops, and I will hate to see that aspect of competition taken away, if live pit stops are going to be the deciding factor as to whether or not the Xfinity Series or the Truck Series, stakes around long term, I'm perfectly fine with doing away with live pit stops, because I'd much rather have the drivers racing on track than I'd rather see guys running around changing tires. I don't mean to mitigate what they do. That's obviously an extremely important part of racing, and it can create some of the most interesting storylines on a given race weekend. But the truth is, I watch racing because I like watching race cars beat and bang off each other and make daring moves on each other more so than I watch for pit road. And if keeping live pit stops is going to cause a lot of these Xfinity teams or Truck Series teams to eventually close down, which means those series could eventually go away, I'm perfectly fine with doing what we have to do there and taking the necessary measures to cut costs and cut certain aspects of the product. And here's the thing, I love how NASCAR is doing this, because NASCAR could have easily just come in and said, we're getting rid of live pit stops, we're going to do it the way the K&N series has been doing it, where we just have breaks in the action, or you take the car off the track, service it, bring it back on, almost like a couple half times, almost like quarters. They could have just done it like that, where there would be no strategy involved whatsoever. But no, I actually it's a little confusing, sure, but like I said, I think once we see it in action, it'll be a lot clearer, a lot easier to understand. But I love that NASCAR is doing it this way, to where now you have to decide, do you want to take fuel? Do you want to take 2 tires? Do you want to pit twice? Take 4? How do you want this to work? How do you want to manage your track position throughout the race? We still basically are getting rid of live pit stops, which is saving money for race teams, but we're also actually adding to the strategy component, adding a strategy element to the races that we didn't have before. Crew chiefs are going to have a lot more pressure on them, I think, this year in these races, because they're going to be faced with decisions and challenges that they've never been faced with before. So NASCAR could have easily just said, all right, we're getting rid of live pit stops, we're just going to have breaks here, nothing's going to actually happen, it's just going to be that. We're just going to freeze the field, and then we're going to rack them up and restart them again after they change tires. That's all they could have done. But no, NASCAR has actually added a new strategy element to these races. So I think if they had to get rid of live pit stops, which is a shame that they have to do that, but I think they do. I think it's a necessary evil in this case. At least NASCAR found a way to at least add something to the racing product. They're not just taking away here. They're taking away one thing and adding something different. Not every fan's going to like that. I'm still not loving it. I wish we still had live pit stops. But if we had to get rid of live pit stops, which I think we have to do in this case, I'm glad NASCAR is doing it in a way that actually adds some sort of strategy element and is going to mix up the field a lot more in these races. We're going to see different names up front at times. We're going to see very interesting strategy calls. I'm excited for what this is going to do to the racing at these select races. Again, this is only just a few races. We're spending a lot of time talking about something that's only going to affect a few races, but this is really interesting. Now, NASCAR did say that these rules are a work in progress and that fan response is going to be a very important factor going forward as to whether or not they're going to implement this further in the future. But here's what Eric Peterson had to say regarding the future of these rules. We're definitely using it as a trial and something we can take a look at with these events and analyze it and go from there. There's no imminent plans to do anything beyond what we're doing right now, but just like everything, we try to look all the time at how we can make it better for our fans and how we're going to use these events to see how it plays out and analyze the results to look at for the future. I remember saying this back, over the summer, whenever I did that last video, whenever these rumors first came out. I remember saying then that if NASCAR eventually does remove all live pit stops from all Xfinity and all Truck Series races in the future, which is something that, if this goes well next year, very well may happen in the future. I said then, and I'll say it again now, if NASCAR does get rid of all pit stops, all live pit stops from Trucks and Xfinity racing, I would hope that it wouldn't be considered a permanent change. I would hope that if NASCAR becomes more financially viable here in 10, 15 years, or however long it takes, I would hope that NASCAR would be open to bringing back live pit stops. Because I'll reiterate this, I prefer live pit stops to not live pit stops. I do. But I also like racing more than I like no racing. So if live pit stops are going to put racing out of business, I'm fine with getting rid of live pit stops, but hopefully only for a temporary measure. If NASCAR one day becomes more financially viable, if teams become more stable, I would hope that NASCAR would consider bringing back live pit stops. I don't want to see this as some sort of ultimatum where NASCAR is going to eliminate live pit stops forever and that's just going to be it. I would like NASCAR to still keep that door open even if it's 10, 15, 20 years from now. I would like for live pit stops to still one day make a return to NASCAR. Now, if NASCAR never gets to that size again, and they never can, if it never becomes financially viable again, fine. We'll do what we gotta do here. We'll figure it out as we go, and it sounds like NASCAR, that's what this next year is gonna be. It's kind of a trial and error, kind of a test, the first prototype, if you will, of a new format. Because I like live pit stops, I think it's a very important competition aspect of racing, and I'd hate to see them gone forever. But sometimes, desperate times call for desperate measures. And whether we like to say it or not, I'm a big NASCAR fan, very positive about the future of NASCAR. I think some good things are definitely here to come very soon. But the truth is, NASCAR, especially financially, is not in a great place right now. And that's why we've consistently seen a lot of cost-cutting measures be put into place in recent months and recent years. And this is just the latest and one of the most interesting, and given that earlier press release, one of the most confusing changes that I think actually is pretty simple once we see it in action. But there we go. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hopefully what I said made sense. Hopefully you guys are following along. There's a lot of articles out there about it, a lot of tweets. Bob Pockris, Jeff Gluck, everyone out there, the usual crowd is offering their analysis of these rules changes. And I think it's, when you really look at it, I think it's pretty simple. And I actually think it is going to add a lot of interesting strategy to some races next year. But it is different, and people are going to take some time getting used to it. As with anything, NASCAR fans are going to immediately react negative, and I think eventually they'll come around. That's the vibe I've always gotten. But let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you love these changes? Do you hate these changes? I think most of us should probably be in the wait and see, kind of spectrum right here, because we don't know how this is going to affect the racing entirely. I don't think it's going to have major effects, but obviously everyone's going to have different opinions on that. We won't know for sure until the first race we see these changes at later this year. So let me know what you guys think down below, but thank you all for watching. Subscribe if you're new. We talk about NASCAR news, rumors, speculation, all this stuff all the time on this show. So subscribe if you're new, follow me on Twitter, follow me on Instagram, and of course a big thank you to my amazing Patreon supporters. Could not do this show without the support I get from all of you on Patreon. You can check out that link down below to see how you can become a Patreon supporter. I'm changing up some stuff over there, going to try and offer some new things to my Patreon supporters here very, very soon, so take a look down there. If you haven't taken a look in a while, we'll be making some changes before too long, but really, really huge thank you to everyone who's continuing to support me and this show every single month. Not sure when the next video is going to be, didn't plan on doing a video today, but with all the Penske news, with the new rules changes, had to make something today. So not sure when the next video will be, probably be pretty soon, always sooner rather than later I feel like. But thanks for watching this one. I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday. Stay Tuesday. Honestly, I lose track of my days. Yeah, Tuesday. Wow. Tuesday. What a day. Thanks for watching, everyone.